What if you were in debt up to your eyeballs? What if you had to borrow even more money to cover your old debts? This is not a horror story. This is the reality of the U.S. debt crisis. And this is what Ray Dalio has been alerting us about. In this video, we're going to explain what the U.S. debt crisis is, what causes it, and what consequences it has. The U.S. debt crisis is not a new phenomenon. The U.S. government has been running budget deficits for most of its history, meaning that it spends more than it collects in taxes. To finance these deficits, the government borrows money by issuing bonds, which are promises to pay back the principal plus interest in the future. The total amount of these bonds outstanding is called the public debt or the national debt. As of November 2023, the U.S. public debt surpassed $33 trillion for the first time, which is equivalent to about 150% of the U.S. gross domestic product, GDP, the total value of goods and services produced in the country in a year. This is the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in U.S. history and one of the highest in the world. Now, you may wonder why this is a problem. After all, the U.S. is a rich and powerful country with a strong economy, a stable political system, and a global reserve currency. Surely it can afford to borrow as much as it wants, right? Well, not exactly. There are several reasons why having too much debt can be harmful to the U.S. and the world economy. Let's go over them one by one. First, having too much debt can reduce economic growth. This is because the government has to pay interest on its debt, which reduces the amount of money available for other spending or investment. Moreover, if the government borrows too much, it can crowd out the private sector, meaning that it competes with businesses and households for the limited supply of credit in the market, driving up interest rates and making it harder for them to borrow and invest. This can slow down the creation of jobs, income, and wealth in the economy. Second, having too much debt can increase inflation. This is because the government may be tempted to print more money to pay for its debt, which increases the supply of money in the economy but not the supply of goods and services. This creates an imbalance between demand and supply, which pushes up the prices of goods and services. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of money, meaning that it reduces the value of the dollar and people's real income. Inflation also makes the debt more expensive to service, as the government has to pay more interest in nominal terms. Third, having too much debt can undermine confidence. This is because the government may face difficulties in rolling over its debt, meaning that it has to issue new bonds to pay for the old ones that are maturing. Suppose the investors who buy these bonds lose confidence in the government's ability or willingness to repay its debt. In that case, they may demand higher interest rates to lend to the government, or they may stop buying the bonds altogether. This can create a vicious cycle, where the government has to borrow more to pay higher interest rates, which increases its debt and reduces its creditworthiness, which leads to even higher interest rates, lower demands for its bonds, and so on. This can trigger a debt crisis, where the government is unable to borrow enough money to pay its obligations and may default on its debt or restructure it by imposing losses on its creditors. A debt crisis can have severe consequences for the U.S. and the world economy. It can cause a recession, as the government has to cut its spending and raise the taxes to reduce its debt, which reduces the aggregated demand and output in the economy. It can also cause a financial crisis, as the default or restructuring of the U.S. debt can create losses and uncertainty for the banks and other financial institutions that hold or trade these bonds, which can impair their solvency and liquidity and disrupt the functioning of the financial system. It can also cause a currency crisis, as the loss of confidence in the U.S. debt can lead to a loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar, which can cause a sharp depreciation of the dollar against other currencies and a flight of capital from the U.S. to other countries. This can reduce the international role and influence of the U.S. and create instability and volatility in the global economy. So, how did the U.S. get into this situation, and what can be done to avoid or mitigate it? Well, according to Ray Dalio, the U.S. is reaching an inflection point where the debt problem is quickly getting worse. He argues that the U.S. is in a large stage of a long-term debt cycle, which is a pattern of rising and falling debt levels over time. He explains that there are two types of debt cycles: the short-term debt cycle, which lasts about 8 to 10 years, and the long-term debt cycle, which lasts about 50 to 75 years. The short-term debt cycle is driven by the central bank's monetary policy, which affects the interest rates and the availability of credit in the economy. The long-term debt cycle is driven by structural changes in the economy, such as productivity, demographics, inequality, and geopolitics, which affects the income and spending of the government, business, and households. Several factors are accelerating this gap, including the fiscal stimulus the U.S. government has implemented to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. This has led to a record-high budget deficit and debt levels as the government spent trillions of dollars and borrowed heavily in a short period. The U.S. Federal Reserve monetary stimulus to support the economy and financial markets has also lowered interest rates to near zero, expanded the money supply by trillions of dollars through quantitative easing, and created a record-high balance sheet and inflationary pressures. The U.S. is facing demographic changes such as an aging population and declining labor force participation, which reduces the potential growth and productivity of the economy. This, in turn, increases the government spending and liabilities on Social Security, healthcare, and pensions. The U.S. is also facing changes in inequality, such as the widening gap between the rich and the poor and the polarization of society and politics. This reduces the social cohesion and political effectiveness of the country, increasing conflicts and tension within and between groups. Geopolitical changes are also affecting the U.S., such as the rise of China and other emerging powers and the decline of the U.S. relative power and influence in the world. This reduces the demand and confidence for the U.S. debt and dollar and increases competition and confrontation among countries. Dalio believes that the U.S. debt crisis is reaching a tipping point. To tackle this problem, the U.S. can either reduce its debt through austerity and restructuring or inflate it away through monetary and fiscal measures. Both options have pros and cons, and the optimal solution depends on cooperation among various stakeholders. Dalio says that the U.S. is facing a difficult and complex challenge and that the outcome is uncertain and unpredictable. He says that the U.S. debt crisis is not inevitable and that it can be avoided or mitigated if the U.S. acts wisely and responsibly. He says that the U.S. has many strengths and advantages, such as its innovation, entrepreneurship, diversity, and resilience, and that it can use them to overcome its weaknesses and challenges. He says that the U.S. has faced and overcome similar crises in the past, such as the Great Depression in the 1930s and the stagflation in the 1970s, and that it can do it again in the present. He says that the U.S. has a choice and that it can either learn from its history and its mistakes or repeat them and suffer the consequences. In this video, we learned about Ray Dalio's analysis of the U.S. debt crisis. The U.S. is facing a serious challenge that could have significant implications for its economy, society, and role in the world. While there are opportunities to address the debt problem, there are also obstacles and risks. The situation requires wisdom, cooperation, creativity, resilience, and responsibility from stakeholders and the American people. Overcoming the crisis is a choice and challenge that the U.S. must face. We hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you want to watch more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to get notified of our latest uploads. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.